Welcome back to the Retro Review. Every battle, every empire, every revolution, and every turning point has a story worth remembering. Without taking much of your time, let's step back in time and explore today's chapter of history, Pearl Harbor. Let's begin. It is just past 7 in the morning, and the island of Oahu is still asleep. Sailors are sleeping off Saturday night. Church bells haven't rung yet. Newspapers sit unread on porches. In the harbor, 96 ships of the United States Pacific Fleet sit at anchor. Engines cold, guns unmanned, ammunition locked away in storage lockers below deck. In less than 2 hours, more than 2,000 of these men will be dead. This is the story of December 7th, 1941. The story of Pearl Harbor, and the story of how a single Sunday morning pulled the United States into the deadliest war in human history, the road to war. To understand what happened at Pearl Harbor, you have to go back further than that morning. You have to go back nearly a decade to a rising empire on the other side of the Pacific. By the early 1930s, Japan was a nation transformed. It had modernized faster than almost any country in history, building a navy and an army that rivaled the great powers of Europe. But Japan had a problem the rest of the world didn't fully appreciate. It had almost no oil, no rubber, and very little iron of its own. Everything that powered its factories and fueled its warships had to come from somewhere else. So Japan looked outward. In 1931, its army seized Manchuria in northern China. In 1937, full-scale war broke out with China itself. A brutal conflict marked by atrocities that shocked the world, including the mass killings in the city of Nanjing. Japan's military leaders spoke of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a polite name for an empire built on conquest. The United States watched this expansion with growing alarm. Washington had trade and diplomatic ties across Asia, and American public opinion turned sharply against Japan as reports of brutality in China spread. Step by step, the United States began tightening the economic noose. It restricted the sale of aircraft parts, then steel and scrap iron. Then, in the summer of 1941, after Japan moved troops into French Indochina, President Franklin Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States and cut off oil exports entirely. That single decision changed everything. Japan imported nearly 80% of its oil from the United States. Without it, its navy had perhaps a year and a half of fuel reserves before its ships would sit dead in the water. To the men running Japan's military, the message was clear: bend to America's demands and abandon the empire they'd spent a decade building, or find oil somewhere else by force and risk war with the most industrially powerful nation on earth. They chose to gamble. The architect, the man tasked with making that gamble work, was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet. Yamamoto was, in many ways, an unlikely author of a war against America. As a young officer, he had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had traveled the country, seen its oil fields in Texas, its automobile factories in Detroit. He understood, in a way few of his colleagues did, the sheer industrial power the United States could bring to bear, if provoked, into a long war. Yamamoto reportedly told Japan's Prime Minister that he could guarantee havoc for 6 months to a year, but that he had no confidence in what would happen after that. He knew Japan could not win a prolonged war against American industry. So his strategy wasn't to defeat the United States outright. It was to cripple its Pacific Fleet in a single, devastating blow, buy time, and force a negotiated peace before America's full strength could be mobilized. The target he chose was Pearl Harbor, the home of the U.S. Pacific Fleet on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. It was an audacious plan. Pearl Harbor sat more than 3,000 miles from Japan. No one had ever launched a successful carrier strike across that kind of distance. Yamamoto's own colleagues thought it was reckless, but he pushed it through, and by late 1941, 6 aircraft carriers, the heart of Japan's naval air power, began quietly assembling at a remote, fog-shrouded anchorage in the Kuril Islands, far from prying eyes. The task force was commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. It carried more than 400 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters, along with the pilots who had trained for months on a single mission, striking ships in a shallow harbor. That training mattered enormously. Pearl Harbor's waters were only about 40 feet deep, far too shallow for a standard aerial torpedo, which would simply plunge into the mud on impact. Japanese engineers solved the problem by fitting torpedoes with special wooden fins that let them run properly, even in shallow water. It was one of several technical breakthroughs that made the attack possible. On November 26, 1941, the strike force slipped out of the Kurils and began a long, silent crossing of the North Pacific. Deliberately avoiding shipping lanes, maintaining strict radio silence, watched over by escorting destroyers and submarines. For nearly 2 weeks, this armada of more than 30 ships crossed one of the largest oceans on Earth, and the United States had no idea it existed. Warning signs ignored. It would be wrong to say America had no warning at all. The truth is messier, and in some ways more tragic. American codebreakers had cracked Japan's diplomatic code, known as Purple, months earlier. Intelligence officers were reading Tokyo's messages to its own diplomats almost as fast as the Japanese themselves. Those messages made clear that negotiations with Washington were failing, and that Japan was preparing for some kind of military action. What they didn't reveal was where. Most American commanders assumed any Japanese strike would fall on the Philippines, Guam, or British and Dutch territory in Southeast Asia. Hawaii, sitting deep in the Pacific and heavily fortified, felt safe. Too far. Too well defended. Nobody seriously believed the Japanese fleet could cross the ocean undetected and strike the heart of American naval power. There were smaller warnings, too, scattered across that final week, that in hindsight feel almost unbearable. On the morning of the attack itself, an Army radar station on Oahu picked up a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. The young operators reported it up the chain, but the officer who took the call assumed it was a flight of American B-17 bombers expected in from California that morning, and told them not to worry about it. An hour before the attack began, a U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Ward, spotted a small Japanese submarine trying to sneak into the harbor and sank it. The first shots of the battle. The report went up the chain of command. By the time anyone acted on it, it was already too late. Even Washington's final diplomatic warning arrived too late to matter. American code breakers intercepted a 14-part message from Tokyo to its ambassadors, effectively breaking off negotiations, and a follow-up message ordering it delivered at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Washington time. Analysts realized that 1 o'clock in Washington was early morning in Hawaii, and understood this might signal an attack. A warning was sent to Pearl Harbor, but delays in transmission meant it didn't arrive until after the bombs had already fallen. There was no single failure, no single villain. It was a chain of assumptions, small delays, and missed connections, each reasonable on its own, that together left America's greatest naval base almost completely unprepared. Sunday morning. By dawn on December 7th, the Japanese carriers had crept to within 230 miles of Oahu, closer than anyone in Hawaii thought possible. At 6 a.m., the first wave began launching from the decks of 6 carriers: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. 183 aircraft climbed into the pale morning sky: fighters, dive bombers, high-level bombers, and torpedo planes carrying those specially modified shallow-water torpedoes. Leading them was Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, flying in the lead bomber. As the formation approached Oahu and broke through the clouds to see the harbor laid out below them, packed with battleships exactly where naval intelligence said they'd be, Fuchida radioed back to the fleet the coded signal for total surprise. Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. Below, Pearl Harbor was as peaceful as any Sunday morning in America. Sailors were eating breakfast. Some were still asleep in their bunks. On Ford Island in the middle of the harbor, the Navy band aboard the USS Nevada was preparing to play the national anthem for the morning flag-raising ceremony. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell. Shot, explosions, chaos, men running to battle stations. The attack came in 2 waves, and it targeted what the Japanese called Battleship Row, the line of American battleships moored along the southeast side of Ford Island. The Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, California, and Nevada. Torpedo planes swept in low over the water, so low that witnesses on the ground said they could see the faces of the pilots. Dive bombers screamed down from above. Within minutes, the harbor was engulfed in smoke, fire, and the thunder of anti-aircraft guns finally, belatedly, opening up. The USS Oklahoma was struck by multiple torpedoes in quick succession. The ship began rolling almost immediately, capsizing within minutes and trapping hundreds of sailors inside the hull, upside down in the dark, some of whom pounded on the steel for days afterward, guiding rescue crews with cutting torches to a desperate few survivors. The USS West Virginia took multiple torpedo hits and began sinking at her moorings, saved from capsizing only by the quick thinking of her crew, who counter-flooded the ship to keep her upright even as she settled to the harbor floor. But it was the USS Arizona that suffered the single worst blow of the entire attack. At around 8:06 a.m., an armor-piercing bomb dropped by a high-level bomber punched through her deck and detonated in a forward ammunition magazine. The explosion was catastrophic, tearing the ship apart from within and sending a fireball hundreds of feet into the air. The Arizona sank in minutes. Nearly 1,100 of her crew died in that single explosion. More than half of all the Americans killed that day. Acts of courage amid chaos. Amid the devastation, there were also stories of extraordinary courage. Ordinary sailors doing extraordinary things in the space of a few impossible minutes. Aboard the USS West Virginia, a mess attendant named Doris Miller had no combat training, and under the rules of the time, wasn't even permitted to fire a weapon in battle because of his role in the ship's segregated support crew. When the attack began, Miller first helped carry his mortally wounded captain to safety, then, with no training whatsoever, manned an anti-aircraft machine gun and began firing on the attacking planes until he ran out of ammunition. He would later become the first black American awarded the Navy Cross, the Navy's second highest honor for valor. At the harbor's airfields, ground crews and pilots scrambled to get aircraft into the sky even as Japanese fighters strafed the runways, destroying most of the fleet's planes before they ever left the ground. A handful of pilots, including George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, managed to get airborne from a small nearby airfield and shot down several attacking aircraft, flying and refueling repeatedly through both waves of the assault. On battleship after battleship, sailors and officers who had been asleep moments earlier ran to their posts through burning, flooding decks, manning guns, fighting fires, and pulling wounded shipmates from the water, often while the ships beneath their feet were sinking. By the time the second wave of Japanese planes finished their attack around 9:45 that morning, the devastation was almost impossible to comprehend. 21 American ships had been sunk or damaged. More than 300 aircraft were destroyed or damaged, most of them still on the ground. 2,403 Americans were dead, and more than 1,100 others wounded. Japan lost fewer than 100 men and only 29 aircraft. The morning after, burning ships, oil slicks, harbor in ruins. By late morning, the Japanese fleet was already turning north, withdrawing toward home. Nagumo made the fateful decision not to launch a third wave against Pearl Harbor's fuel depots, repair yards, and submarine base, choosing to preserve his carriers rather than risk them searching for an American fleet whose location he didn't know. It was a decision some historians believe cost Japan the chance to inflict even more lasting damage, since without those fuel tanks and repair facilities, the Pacific Fleet might have been forced to retreat all the way back to the American mainland. In Hawaii, the harbor still burned through the afternoon and into the night, thick black smoke rising for hours over the wreckage of Battleship Row. Rescue crews worked frantically, cutting into capsized hulls, searching for survivors trapped in air pockets. News of the attack reached Washington by mid-morning local time. President Franklin Roosevelt was informed shortly after receiving the first garbled reports and immediately began preparing the nation's response. Across the country, Americans learned of the attack through radio bulletins that interrupted Sunday afternoon programming, and for millions of people, it was the moment the war in Europe and Asia stopped being someone else's problem and became their own. The following day, December 8th, Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. He opened with words that would be remembered for generations, describing the previous day as a date that would live in infamy, and asked Congress for a formal declaration of war against the Empire of Japan. The vote passed almost unanimously within the hour. 3 days later, on December 11th, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies under the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States in turn. What had been, for 2 years, primarily a European and Asian conflict was now, unmistakably, a world war, and the United States was in it completely. Aftermath and legacy. In the weeks that followed, the nation reeled from both grief and fear. Rumors of a follow-up invasion swept the West Coast. Blackout drills became routine. And in one of the darkest chapters of the American home front, fear and prejudice combined to produce the forced relocation and internment of more than 120,000 Japanese Americans. The majority of them United States citizens, stripped of their homes and freedom for years based on nothing but their ancestry, At Pearl Harbor itself, salvage crews spent months righting and repairing ships once thought lost forever. Astonishingly, all but 3 of the vessels damaged or sunk that day, the Arizona, the Oklahoma, and the target ship Utah, were eventually raised, repaired, and returned to service, many of them going on to fight in battles across the Pacific in the years that followed. The USS Arizona was never raised. Too many of her crew remained entombed within her hull. Today she rests where she sank, and the white memorial that arches over her wreckage each year draws over 1 million visitors, many of whom watch drops of oil still leaking from her fuel tanks after more than 8 decades rise silently to the surface, a phenomenon sailors have come to call the tears of the Arizona. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who planned the attack, did not live to see how the war he had gambled on would end. He was killed in April 1943. When American code breakers, in one of the war's great intelligence triumphs, intercepted his flight schedule and sent fighter planes to shoot down his aircraft over the Pacific. He had once warned his superiors that a war with America would only awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. Whether or not he spoke those exact words, the sentiment proved prophetic. Japan had bought itself roughly 6 months of unchallenged advantage in the Pacific. And then the full weight of American industry and manpower began to turn against it, a tide that would not stop until the war ended in the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki nearly 4 years later. The present-day USS Arizona Memorial, names etched in marble, waters still. Pearl Harbor lasted less than 2 hours, from the first bomb to the last. In that time, more than 2,400 Americans lost their lives, most of them still in their 20s, many of them still in their bunks when the first torpedoes struck. It remains, to this day, one of the most consequential mornings in American history. The moment a nation that had tried for 2 years to stay out of a global war found that the war had come looking for it anyway. The ships have long since been raised or memorialized. The veterans who survived that morning are, sadly, nearly all gone now. But the harbor remains, and so does the memory. A reminder of how quickly peace can end, and how a single Sunday morning can change the course of an entire century. The attack on Pearl Harbor lasted less than 2 hours, but its impact echoed across the world for generations. It changed the course of World War II, reshaped global history, and proved that a single moment can alter the destiny of nations forever. Here at the Retro Review, we believe history is more than just dates in a textbook. It's a collection of incredible stories, unforgettable people, impossible decisions, and moments that continue to shape the world we live in today. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most defining events. If you enjoyed this documentary, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the Retro Review, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey into the past. Now it's your turn. What are your thoughts on Pearl Harbor? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Or was history already moving toward this moment? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one of them. Until our next journey through time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep history alive. Because every event has a story, every decision has consequences, and every chapter of history brings us closer to understanding our world. This is the Retro Review. We'll see you in the next chapter of history.